There's a moment that replays in your mind. A memory you thought you'd buried. It's the look on their face, the exact curve of their mouth when they said something that cut you to the bone. They didn't forget what they did to you. They remember it in a way that feels colder than amnesia. They remember every silent moment that broke you down, every word that shattered you. They were fully present for all of it. They saw the look in your eyes when you fell apart. They watched you, and then they walked away like nothing ever happened. No apology, no explanation, just silence. Like your pain was a ghost they couldn't see. But what if I told you their silence was never about you? It was about something they couldn't stand to look at. This wasn't forgetfulness. This wasn't immaturity. This wasn't a mistake. It was psychological projection, a defense mechanism that Carl Jung believed could destroy relationships and fracture minds. Jung discovered that when people can't face their own darkness, they find someone else to carry it. And that someone was you. You became the perfect mirror for their shadow, the hidden part of their unconscious they refused to see. They didn't forget your pain. They needed you to carry theirs. To truly acknowledge the harm they caused would demand something they've spent their entire life avoiding. Accountability. And accountability is a death sentence for the false identity they've built. So they erased you to protect the lie they still live in. They moved on not because they healed, but because they refused to look back. Not because they forgot, but because remembering would mean awakening. And awakening requires courage. The kind of courage they never developed. And here's the part that stings the most. Their silence was not weakness. It was not confusion. It was not absence. It was a strategy. Because when they say nothing, you start saying everything. You replay every word. You question every emotion. You begin to doubt the reality that once felt so certain. And that's the moment they win. But not anymore. Because what you're about to hear will change the way you understand betrayal. It will unravel the psychology behind the coldest kind of harm and show you exactly why they hurt you and walked away without a trace of guilt. This is not just a story. It's your awakening. Stay with me. Carl Jung believed that every human carries a hidden side, a part of us we refuse to see. Not because it isn't real, but because admitting it would shatter the image we hold of ourselves. He called it the shadow. The shadow is everything we disown. Our rage, our guilt, our fear, our need to control, our capacity to harm. And most people don't face their shadow. They run from it, bury it, dress it up with politeness, well-rehearsed smiles, and a lifetime of pleasantries. But it doesn't go away. In fact, the more they deny it, the more it leaks out until one day it finds a target. That target was you. You didn't provoke it. You didn't deserve it. But you became the perfect mirror for their darkness. Because people don't always project onto strangers. They project onto those who are safe, those who are kind, those who are willing to understand. And that's why it was you who suffered. They didn't attack you for who you are. They attacked you for who they couldn't be. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But people rarely choose understanding. They choose escape. And escape looks like blaming you, shaming you, harming you. So they don't have to harm themselves. Because in their world, admitting fault equals collapse. So instead, they transfer the burden. They made you feel guilty for being wounded. They made you question your reaction to their abuse. They made your truth feel like a crime. That was not clumsiness. That was projection in its purest, most dangerous form. And here's the truth Jung saw more clearly than anyone. People don't just hurt you by accident. Sometimes they use you. Not for love, not for connection, but to bleed out the parts of themselves they're too afraid to face. You were their release valve, their emotional scapegoat, their unconscious therapist. But you were never meant to carry that weight because the shadow they projected onto you was never yours to hold. And the pain they caused was never about you. It was the only way they knew how to run from themselves. There's something we tell ourselves to survive betrayal. Maybe they forgot. Maybe they weren't thinking clearly. Maybe they were going through something. Maybe they didn't mean it. But Carl Jung would have told you something far more unsettling. They didn't forget. They chose not to remember. Forgetting is passive. Forgetting is accidental. But what they did was intentional. Not in the sense of premeditated cruelty, but in the sense of a conscious avoidance. You see, awareness comes at a cost because to remember would mean admitting the damage they caused. It would mean looking into the mirror without flinching. It would mean confronting the parts of themselves they've spent a lifetime running from. And for some people, that level of self-awareness is unbearable. So instead, they craft an illusion. One where you were too sensitive, one where you misunderstood, one where you made it worse. They rewrite the memory in real time. They turn truth into opinion, fact into fog, pain into a misinterpretation. Because accountability demands change, and change threatens their survival. Not their physical survival, but the survival of the image they've built, the persona they've worn, the identity that says, I'm the good one. I didn't do anything wrong. I'm a victim of misunderstanding. So, they don't just refuse to apologize. They refuse to remember because memory is a mirror and mirrors are dangerous when you're hiding from your reflection. Jung once said, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Terrifying, because it means owning every shadow, every sharp word, every selfish choice. Every time they watched you break and stayed silent, they protected themselves not from you, but from the shame that would devour them if they let the truth in. So no, they didn't forget. They didn't move on. They buried the memory beneath layers of denial, self-justification, and silence. But here's what Jung understood. That buried guilt doesn't disappear. It transforms into projection, into distortion, into the quiet violence of pretending nothing ever happened. So the next time you wonder why they never apologized, don't assume they're unaware. Assume they're protecting something. Not their heart, not their love, their image. And to protect that, they had to erase you from the story. Because remembering you would mean facing themselves. Carl Jung believed that every person wears a mask. He called it the persona, a carefully crafted identity we show the world, not to express who we are, but to protect who we don't want anyone to see. First, it's harmless. The polite version of yourself at work. The smile you give when you're dying inside. The I'm fine you whisper when you're anything but. But for some people, the mask becomes everything. They don't just wear it, they worship it, protect it, build their entire life around it. To them, the persona isn't a tool. It's who they think they are. And here's where it gets dangerous. The persona must always be innocent, always justified, always good. So what happens when they hurt someone? What happens when the mask cracks? They don't apologize. They double down. Because admitting fault would mean shattering the very image that holds them together. Not just socially, but psychologically. Jung called this state of living the provisional life. A life built not on authenticity, but on maintaining an illusion of control and virtue. It's the life of someone who never really confronts their inner world. Someone who survives by staying just deep enough to function, but never deep enough to transform. These people don't grow, they maintain, they justify. They intellectualize everything except their own flaws. And when their actions hurt you, they don't ask, what did I do? They ask, why are you so upset? Because to them, your pain is a threat to their perfection. They minimize your reality to preserve their mask. They turn your trauma into drama, your honesty into an attack, your boundaries into betrayal, and slowly, without realizing it, you begin shrinking to protect their image too. You stop asking for what you need. You downplay your hurt. You walk on eggshells just to keep the peace. But peace that requires your silence is not peace. It's emotional captivity. And Jung warned us, what you resist not only persists but grows in size. The more they protect their mask, the more destructive their shadow becomes. Because the provisional life is not life at all. It's a performance. And you were never cast in their play to be seen. You were cast to validate the role they refused to stop playing. The mask isn't just for others. It's for themselves. Because if they ever take it off, they might finally see the damage they've done. You thought the silence meant confusion, that they didn't know what to say, that they were processing. Maybe they needed space, time to think, time to heal. But the truth is darker. Silence isn't always absence. It's not always ignorance. Sometimes silence is strategy. Because when someone hurts you and says nothing, they force you to fill in the gaps. You start questioning everything. Did I overreact? Was I too sensitive? Maybe I misunderstood. And while your mind loops through 1,000 replays, they remain untouched, unmoved by the chaos they caused. Carl Jung warned that silence isn't neutral. In emotionally manipulative people, it becomes a psychological weapon, one that distorts reality and shifts accountability. Because when they don't answer, you start apologizing for asking. When they don't explain, you start inventing reasons to justify their behavior. Their silence creates a void. And in that void, your mind builds a prison. You overthink, overanalyze, blame yourself for the distance they created. All while they maintain the illusion of innocence. But here's what Jung understood better than anyone. Where wisdom reigns, there is no conflict between thinking and feeling. Yet their silence splits the two. You feel deeply, but think yourself into guilt. And that's the point. Because the more confused you become, the more powerful they feel. Silence becomes a throne, and your desperation for closure becomes the crown they never earned. Every time you reach out, every time you explain yourself again, every time you beg for clarity, you hand them control. They didn't give you silence by accident. They gave it to watch you crumble. They weaponized absence. They turned emotional detachment into domination. Because silence isn't always avoidance. Sometimes it's precision. It's the exact tool needed to keep you unstable, to keep you hoping, to keep you chasing an apology that was never coming. And the more you chase, the more you feel like the problem. But you were never the problem. You were the mirror. And they hated what they saw. So they said nothing. Not because they didn't care, but because they knew. If they stayed silent long enough, you'd start punishing yourself for their damage. And in that silence, they didn't just escape blame. They built your cage. It didn't happen all at once. At first, it was subtle. A raised eyebrow, a dismissive tone, a comment like, "You're being dramatic," or, "I don't remember it that way." And slowly, your certainty began to erode. You started questioning what you felt, then what you saw, then who you were. This is the gaslight loop. But its origin runs deeper than simple manipulation. Carl Jung called it shadow projection, the unconscious act of pushing one's darkest parts onto someone else, to avoid the horror of facing them directly. But projection alone isn't enough, because once their shadow is on you, they still have to make you accept it. That's where gaslighting comes in. They don't just deny what happened, they rewrite it, they minimize it, they twist it until you become the unstable one. Your pain becomes an overreaction. Your memory becomes unreliable. Your truth becomes an inconvenience. And in their rewritten version of events, you're no longer the one who was hurt. You're the one who's too much, too sensitive, too emotional, too reactive. And you begin to believe them because you want things to make sense, because you want peace, because you want to be loved. And love for them requires you to forget your own reality. But here's the truth Jung uncovered. People project not just to escape shame, but to survive. Their entire identity is built on being the good one, the misunderstood one, the morally justified one. So your pain becomes a threat to their image, and instead of facing it, they use your empathy against you. They say you're exaggerating. They say you're attacking them. They cry when you confront them. So you end up comforting the very person who caused the wound. They've made their guilt your apology, their chaos your responsibility. And every time you accept their version of reality, you lose a piece of your own. This isn't confusion. It's control. Not through shouting, but through distortion. Carl Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." In their world, you're fated to be the villain. Not because it's true, but because their fragile identity can't survive being anything else. And so the loop continues. They hurt you, erase it, blame you, then make you doubt it ever happened. And in the end, you're left holding a truth that was never yours to carry. There's a kind of person who always seems blameless. No matter what happens, they're never at fault, never the aggressor, never the one who needs to change. They cry first. They explain the loudest. They make you feel like the villain, even when you're the one bleeding. Carl Jung warned about this psychological mask. He called it the innocent archetype, a deep-rooted identity formed around the refusal to acknowledge one's capacity to cause harm. These people aren't just avoiding guilt. They're addicted to innocence. They've built their entire emotional existence on one belief. If I admit I'm capable of hurting others, I'm no longer lovable. So they choose a different path, permanent victimhood. Even when they're the ones causing chaos, they find a way to spin the story. You misunderstood. You provoked them. You were too much, too cold, too unavailable, too emotional. Anything but them. Because the moment they admit they caused pain, they would have to confront the very shadow they've worked so hard to bury. And that's a confrontation they're not ready for. So instead, they hide behind tears. They retreat into silence. They make your pain about them. And they weaponize their hurt to avoid ever being held accountable. They don't grow. They don't evolve because they're emotionally frozen, stuck in a role they started playing long ago to protect themselves from guilt. They became the good one, the one who always meant well, the one who tried their best. And when things fall apart, that's the only story they know how to tell. But here's the cruel twist. When someone is addicted to being innocent, they will hurt you just to maintain the illusion that they've never hurt anyone. They'll twist facts, erase events, blame your tone, your timing, your emotions, because if they're not innocent, they're nothing. And so, you're left with the weight of their mistakes, carrying the guilt they were never willing to face. Jung knew this pattern well. It's not just immaturity, it's psychological survival at your expense. There's a reason some people can't say, "I'm sorry." It's not because they don't understand what they did. It's because the act of apologizing would cause their entire identity to collapse. Carl Jung called this state psychological inflation. When the ego becomes so enlarged, so over-identified with perfection that it can't tolerate contradiction, can't admit error, can't accept the shadow it desperately avoids. These are the people who live inside a fragile mirror. Every reflection must confirm their goodness, their intelligence, their moral superiority. Because if the image cracks, they shatter with it. This is narcissism at its psychological core. Not just vanity, not just self-obsession, but the violent rejection of anything that threatens the perfect self-image. So when they hurt you and you confront them, they don't see truth. They see danger. You're not holding up a mirror. You're holding up a hammer. And instead of facing the wound, they attack the one who noticed it. Because to them, accountability isn't growth, it's ego death. To say, "I was wrong," would mean admitting they aren't who they pretend to be. That the mask has cracks. That the persona they built is just that, a mask. And so they defend it at all costs. They'll twist the facts, rewrite the past, blame your tone, call you unstable. They'll do anything except take responsibility. Because in their mind, being wrong isn't just uncomfortable, it's unlivable. Their entire emotional survival depends on maintaining the illusion that they are always right, always justified, always the one who was misunderstood. And when you demand accountability, you're not just asking for an apology. You're asking them to destroy the very thing that keeps them psychologically afloat. Jung warned us, when an inner situation is not made conscious, it appears outside as fate. To them, you were the fate, the punishment, the enemy. Not because you did something wrong, but because your truth threatens the false kingdom they rule from. They don't run from guilt. They run from identity collapse. That's why they avoid the simplest phrase, "I'm sorry," because to them, it's not just an admission, it's annihilation. And so they choose the easier path. Silence, deflection, denial, because ego to them is not a mask they wear. It's a fortress they live in. They didn't just hurt you, they had to erase you, because your memory is dangerous to them. Not because of what you did, but because of what your presence reveals. Carl Jung believed that when the ego is fragile, it cannot tolerate contradiction. Any reminder of wrongdoing, any trace of guilt, any reflection of damage becomes a threat to the illusion they've built. So they do what they've always done. They dissociate, they deny, they forget, not because they can't remember, but because remembering would break them. You are a walking reminder of a truth they can't live with, a mirror they've spent years trying to avoid. So they edit the story. They cut you from the narrative, not with malice, but with necessity. Because if they acknowledged what they did, if they really let it in, They would have to confront a version of themselves they've buried under years of image maintenance. And that confrontation would feel like death. So what do they do instead? They pretend you were never that important. They minimize the relationship. They talk about you like a phase. They make you small so their guilt shrinks with you. This is emotional amnesia, a selective forgetting, but it's not a memory issue. It's a defense mechanism. To stay whole, they had to make you vanish. Not just from their life, but from their reality. And that's why the silence hurts so much. Because it's not just absence, it's erasure. It's the realization that someone can hold your heart, destroy it, and then walk away as if it never existed. Not because they don't care, but because they can't afford to. Because to them, caring would collapse the mask. And so they disappear emotionally, psychologically, existentially. And you're left not just grieving what happened, but grieving the terrifying possibility that it never meant anything to them at all. But the truth is, it did. It meant enough that they had to destroy the evidence just to live with themselves. They didn't forget you. They buried you to keep their fragile world intact. Guilt in a healthy mind is a compass. Points us back to our values. It whispers, something I did hurt someone. I should make it right. Carl Jung called this the moral function of the unconscious. The quiet voice that helps us grow by illuminating where we've gone wrong. But for emotionally immature people, guilt doesn't act as guidance. It feels like an attack, a threat, an infection. And instead of facing it, they externalize it. They don't say, I feel guilty for what I did to you. They say, you're making me feel bad. They twist the function of guilt, turn it into a weapon, and point it at you. Because in their world, if they feel pain, someone else must be to blame. So they project it onto you, onto your tone, your timing, your reaction. They punish you for triggering the one emotion that could actually redeem them. And the most tragic part, they convince you that your pain is the problem. That if you hadn't spoken up, if you just stayed silent, if you delivered your truth more gently, none of this would have happened. But here's the reality Jung saw clearly. People who refuse to process guilt don't get rid of it. They simply hand it to someone else. You became their emotional scapegoat, the sponge for a conscience they refused to carry. And every time you held them accountable, they didn't hear love. They heard war. Your vulnerability became the battlefield, your truth, the enemy. And instead of apologizing, they made you question why you ever expected decency in the first place. Because guilt for them isn't a guide back to self-awareness. It's a curse they have to purge, no matter who gets burned. Jung once wrote, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. But these people don't want light. They want insulation. And if that means placing their guilt on your shoulders, they'll do it without hesitation. You weren't asking for too much. You were asking for reflection. But when someone sees their own conscience as an enemy, even your honesty becomes unforgivable. There comes a moment on every healing journey when the truth stops whispering and starts screaming. That moment is this. You can't wake someone who wants to stay asleep. You can't love them into awareness. You can't hold them long enough, patiently enough, purely enough to make them see what they refuse to face. Carl Jung said it with piercing clarity. You cannot make unconscious people conscious. And yet you tried. You explained. You forgave. You softened your tone. You swallowed your truth. You gave them chance after chance, thinking, if I just love them right, they'll finally understand. But love doesn't create awareness. Choice does. And awareness demands courage. The kind of courage that most emotionally immature people avoid at all costs. Because to become conscious means to take responsibility, to stop blaming, to stop running, to stop projecting. It means facing the shadow they've spent a lifetime denying. And most people aren't ready to meet that version of themselves because it threatens the very foundation they've built their identity on. So they stay asleep. Not because they don't see the signs, but because they've learned how to look away, how to numb, how to distract, how to survive without ever evolving. And every time you tried to pull them into the light, they dragged you deeper into the dark. Not because they hate you, but because your awareness exposed their denial. And denial doesn't go quietly. It fights, it blames, it shames, it disappears. And so here you are still reaching, still hoping, still believing that if you just hold on a little longer, they'll wake up. But they won't. Not because they can't, but because they don't want to. And that is the moment you stop trying to fix them and start freeing yourself. This is your point of surrender. Not because you gave up on love, but because you finally gave it to the one person who deserves it most. You have spent so long wondering if you were too sensitive, too emotional, too much. But let me offer you a truth that Carl Jung would have whispered in your darkest moment. You weren't weak. You were awake. You saw what they refused to see. You felt what they buried. You named what they denied. That's not weakness. That's clarity. And clarity comes at a cost. They didn't erase you because you didn't matter. They erased you because you were the mirror, the one thing they couldn't face without cracking. They needed you gone so they could keep the mask on. But their denial doesn't make your truth disappear. Your pain is real. Your memory is valid. Your experience was never too much. They just didn't have the strength to carry it. And so they handed it back to you, wrapped in silence, blame, and shame. But here's what matters now. You didn't lose yourself. You're still here, still breathing, still healing. And that means they didn't break you, they revealed you. Because real love remembers. Real maturity says, that was my fault. Real healing doesn't come from erasing. It comes from integrating. Let this be the line you draw in the sand. The moment you stop blaming yourself for their fear and start walking toward the person who was always there, even when they made you question her, this is not your ruin. It's your awakening. And you never have to explain your truth again.